I say there's nothing wrong with me nor the concept.
From Don King, the boxing promoter who beat a man to death over a $600 debt and still rose to become one of the most powerful men in fight history, to Carlos Monzon, the untouchable Argentine champion convicted after his wife was strangled and thrown from a balcony. Here are boxing icons who got away with murder. Don King. There's probably no name in boxing's long and complicated history that generates more simultaneous fascination and suspicion than Don King's. The hair, the American flags, the 1,000-watt smile plastered across a face that could sell you anything and frequently did, often to the fighters who trusted him. But before all of that, before "only in America" became a catchphrase, before Muhammad Ali and George Foreman met in the jungle in Zaire in one of the most famous promotional coups in sports history, Don King was a small-time numbers runner in Cleveland, Ohio. And in 1966, on the sidewalk outside his own home, he beat a man to death over a debt that amounted to $600. The man's name was Sam Garrett, a former employee who owed King that money. King confronted him. What followed was not a fight between two equal men. It was a sustained one-sided assault that involved pistol whipping and repeated kicking, and it left Garrett unable to survive it. Don King was arrested, tried, and convicted of second-degree murder. Not an allegation, not a suspicion. A verdict delivered by a jury of his peers that said, clearly and without ambiguity, you killed a man and you knew what you were doing. And here is where the story takes the kind of turn that boxing seems almost architecturally designed to produce. On appeal, the second-degree murder conviction was reduced to voluntary manslaughter. King served 3 years and 11 months. For ending a human life, he served less time than some people spend in a graduate program. And then, in 1983, Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes, a political ally by that point, granted him a full pardon, wiping the conviction from his official record entirely. It is worth noting that this was not even King's first encounter with lethal violence. In 1954, over a decade before the Garrett killing, he shot and killed a man who was allegedly attempting to rob one of his gambling operations. That incident was ruled justifiable homicide. No charges were filed. In the space of 12 years, Don King was involved in 2 deaths. He walked away clean from one and served under 4 years for the other. He then went on to build one of the most powerful promotional operations in the history of combat sports. The Rumble in the Jungle, the Thrilla in Manila, the careers of dozens of champions. When allegations of corruption began surfacing publicly in 1977 through investigative journalism, King didn't retreat. He went on camera, leaned into his public persona with characteristic theatrical force, and challenged the world to prove something on him.
I say there's nothing wrong with me nor the concept.
There are no kickbacks and there are no problems with...
The boldness was almost breathtaking for a man standing in the long shadow of a body on a Cleveland sidewalk. The challenge landed in the way he intended, not as an admission, but as a performance of invulnerability. And for all intents and purposes, it worked. Sonny Liston. If Don King represents what happens when a man with a violent past accumulates power through charm and business acumen, then Sonny Liston is the cautionary tale about what happens when the system never quite lets a man go, and when the world a man is born into never gives him a real chance to begin with. Liston was born in rural Arkansas, somewhere around 1930, into a poverty so complete and so absolute that there was no birth certificate to mark his arrival. He was one of at least 25 children born to a sharecropper father who beat him with enough frequency and force that the scars were still visible on his body decades later. He grew up without shoes on his feet, without adequate schooling, and without any clear concept of a future that looked different from the dirt fields where he spent his earliest years working. By the time he was a teenager, following his mother to St. Louis, he was already large, already powerful, and already in the street. He led a gang. He mugged people. He robbed gas stations and diners, wearing a yellow shirt distinctive enough that the St. Louis police gave him a nickname after it, the Yellow Shirt Bandit. In 1950, he was convicted of armed robbery and sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary, where Catholic chaplains saw something in the enormous young man with the freakishly large hands and encouraged him to channel it into boxing. The channeling worked spectacularly. He was paroled in 1952, had a brief but dominant amateur career, and turned professional in 1953. By 1962, he was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, having destroyed Floyd Patterson in 2 minutes and 6 seconds, but he never left the world that made him. His management was controlled by organized crime figures Frankie Carbo and Frank Blinky Palermo, both later convicted racketeers. He worked on the side as an enforcer, collecting debts, breaking strikes, doing the kind of work that powerful criminal men need done by someone with enormous hands and nothing much to lose. Then, on December 30th, 1970, he was found dead by his wife in their Las Vegas home. The official cause, heart failure, but there were needle marks. There were traces of heroin. His wife had been away for several days. Sean Assel's book, The Murder of Sonny Liston, explored the theory that someone may have injected him with a lethal overdose while he was already drunk. A business dispute settled the old-fashioned the way men like Sonny Liston had settled things his whole life. No homicide investigation was opened. No one was ever charged. No one ever will be. The man who was arguably the most physically intimidating heavyweight who ever lived died alone in a house in Nevada, and the case that was never opened remains that way, permanently cold. Jack Blackburn. Not every name on this list belongs to a household legend. Jack Blackburn doesn't show up in the casual boxing conversations most people have. But if you've ever heard of Joe Louis, and if you've cared about boxing at any point in your life, you have, then you've heard of the man Jack Blackburn built him into. Because Blackburn was Louis's trainer, the chief architect behind the Brown Bombers' legendary technical mastery, and one of the most gifted and influential boxing minds of the 20th century. He was also convicted of manslaughter. Blackburn's own fighting career was remarkable and largely forgotten. He competed through the early decades of the 1900s as a lightweight and welterweight, regularly fighting men who outweighed him, regularly holding his own against legends of the era, Sam Langford, Joe Gans, figures who today carry Hall of Fame reputations. He was skilled, fearless, possessed of a sharp jab and excellent footwork, and deeply, chronically prone to alcohol. In January of 1909, in Philadelphia, his drinking and his temper collided with catastrophic results. The exact details of what triggered the altercation have never been fully reconstructed from the historical record, but what is documented is that Blackburn fired multiple shots. A man named Alonzo Polk died from the wounds he received. Polk's wife was shot at close range. Blackburn's own partner was also struck. He was charged with first-degree murder. That charge was reduced and he was convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 10 to 15 years. He served approximately 4 years and 8 months, reportedly spending a considerable portion of that time teaching boxing to the prison warden and the warden's family, which says something interesting both about how the world worked for talented men and about how fundamentally useful Blackburn's particular skills were to anyone who encountered them. He resumed fighting after his release. He trained, he transitioned into cornerman work, and eventually, in 1935, he took on a young amateur named Joe Louis and began transforming raw power into something technically extraordinary. Louis called him Chappie. Blackburn was the closest thing to a father figure that Louis encountered in the sport, and when Blackburn died in 1942, Louis was devastated. In 1935, between his conviction and his ascent to legendary trainer status, Blackburn was involved in another shooting incident. Bystanders were wounded. Charges were dropped. The pattern was consistent. A man of considerable talent and considerable volatility, navigating a world that, at every turn, found his talent more useful than his violence was disqualifying. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1992. The manslaughter conviction was a footnote by then. Ron Lyle. Some stories on this list involve men who committed violence and avoided consequences through wealth, influence, or legal fortune. Ron Lyle's story is more complicated, more layered, and in many ways more affecting than any of those. It is the story of a man who may not have pulled the trigger the first time, who served 7 years for a murder he maintained he didn't commit, and who then, years later, found himself charged with murder a second time and acquitted again. Lyle grew up in Denver's Northeast Side housing projects, one of 19 children, and dropped out of school at 17 after a dispute with a basketball coach. At 19, he was caught up in a gang-related shooting that left a young man dead. Lyle's version of events was that he was being attacked with a lead pipe, that the situation was a gang confrontation that spiraled, and that he was not the person who fired the fatal shot, that he was, in essence, covering for someone else. The jury didn't accept that account. Second-degree murder, 15 to 25 years. What happened to him inside the Colorado State Penitentiary in 1965 is the kind of story that is difficult to hear without feeling the weight of it. Another inmate attacked him and stabbed him multiple times. Lyle was, by multiple accounts, clinically pronounced dead on the operating table twice during the 7-hour surgery required to keep him alive. He survived, and in the solitary confinement that followed, living on almost nothing, he began exercising. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats, hour after hour, day after day. The man who emerged was not the same one who had gone in. He later talked about what prison taught him and and what had inspired him while he was there. There was a direct line in his mind from Liston's story to his own, from survival to purpose. He was paroled in 1969 and turned professional at age 30. He knocked out virtually everyone he faced. In May 1975, he fought Muhammad Ali for the undisputed heavyweight championship. He controlled the first 10 rounds. He led on the scorecards. Ali stopped him in the 11th, controversially, in Lyle's view, and in the view of many who watched it. In 1978, he was charged with the murder of a friend during a confrontation over money. He was acquitted. There were no further charges. He died in 2011. Rubin Hurricane Carter. Of all the stories on this list, Rubin Carter's is the one that sits most uneasily under the heading "Got Away with Murder," because the terrible clarifying truth at the center of his story is that he didn't commit one, he was framed for one. And the state of New Jersey, having committed to that frame, spent the better part of 2 decades defending it against all available evidence. Carter was a middleweight contender in the early 1960s, nicknamed Hurricane for the ferocity with which he attacked. A man capable of stunning the boxing world with a first-round knockout of the former champion Emil Griffith in 1963. He was ranked in the top 3 middleweights in the world and working toward a title shot when, in the early hours of June 17, 1966, 3 people were shot and killed at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey. Carter and a young man named John Artis were stopped in their car near the scene, roughly the right area, roughly the right time, in a vehicle that loosely matched a description of the getaway car. They were questioned. They were released. Then, months later, a petty criminal named Alfred Bello, who had been present near the bar that night in connection with a separate burglary, gave a statement that put Carter and Artis at the scene. They were arrested, tried before an all-white jury, and convicted of first-degree murder in 1967. What followed was one of the most sustained and ultimately devastating examples of prosecutorial and systemic failure in modern American legal history. Bello recanted. Then he recanted his recantation. The New Jersey Supreme Court overturned the convictions in 1976, citing withheld evidence about deals made with the key witnesses. Carter and Artis were retried. The second jury convicted them again, this time on a racial revenge theory that prosecutors had effectively constructed from whole cloth. Carter spent 19 years in a New Jersey prison. Bob Dylan wrote a song about his case. Muhammad Ali campaigned for his release. And in 1985, a federal judge granted habeas corpus, concluding in his written opinion that the convictions were built upon an appeal to racism rather than reason, and upon concealment rather than disclosure. Charges were formally dismissed in 1988. Carter moved to Canada. He spent the rest of his life pulling other wrongly convicted people out of the same machinery that had consumed the best years of his own. He died in 2014 at 76 years old, never convicted of anything that withstood legal scrutiny, a man whose entry on a list like this is the most complicated possible kind, not because he got away with a crime, but because the crime committed was the one done to him. Carlos Monzon. Carlos Monzon was the kind of fighter who didn't just win matches, he dominated entire eras. For 7 consecutive years, from 1970 to 1977, he held the undisputed middleweight championship of the world, defending it 14 times against 11 different opponents, a record that stood for decades. He was never stopped in a professional bout. He was never knocked out. He retired undefeated across the final 80-plus fights of his career, and in Argentina, where he was born in poverty and rose to the pinnacle of the sporting world, he was not simply famous. He was a monument. He was the kind of figure whose face appeared on murals, whose name was spoken with the particular reverence reserved for things that feel larger than human, which makes what happened on Valentine's Day, 1988, all the more difficult to sit with. Monzon and his common-law wife, Uruguayan model Alicia Muñiz, were on vacation in the coastal resort city of Mar del Plata when a violent argument escalated past any point of recovery. Muñiz ended up dead on the ground below a second-floor balcony. Monzon was also injured. He claimed he had fallen over the railing himself while trying to reach for her, that it was an accident, that she had fallen. He pointed to his own shoulder injury as evidence of his version of events. The autopsy told an entirely different story. Forensic examination established that Alicia Muñiz had been strangled into unconsciousness before she went over that railing. She had not fallen. She had not jumped. She had been choked and thrown. Monzon was arrested immediately. He was convicted of homicide in 1989 and sentenced to 11 years. He served approximately 6 before dying on January 8, 1995, in a car that rolled over near Santa Rosa de Calchines while he was returning to prison after a weekend furlough for good behavior. He was 52 years old. Thousands attended his funeral. His supporters chanted his nickname in the streets. The tragedy of the Monzon story, and it is a tragedy in the classical sense, meaning the destruction of something great by its own fatal weakness, is how visible the warning signs had been. His first wife had shot him during a domestic dispute in the 1970s. There were other incidents, other allegations, but he was a champion, and in the culture he inhabited, that designation carried a kind of protective force that ordinary men do not enjoy. He died before serving his full sentence. The statues were eventually contested. Some were removed under protest, and the name that was once spoken only with reverence now carries a shadow it cannot shake. Terry Marsh. There is an old principle embedded in British boxing culture that says the sport takes everything from you eventually. Your body, your money, sometimes your health, and in a few noteworthy cases, your freedom. Terry Marsh never fully lost any of those things, but for 10 months in 1990, standing in the dock at the Old Bailey charged with attempted murder, he came uncomfortably close to losing the last one. Marsh retired from professional boxing in 1987 as the undefeated IBF light welterweight champion of the world. His record was 26 wins, 0 losses, 1 draw. Before boxing, he had served in the Royal Marines, deployed to Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and worked as a firefighter with the Essex County Fire and Rescue Service. He was, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most grounded and interesting characters British boxing had ever produced, a working-class hero who wore both his professional discipline and his outspokenness with equal ease. His relationship with promoter Frank Warren, who managed him through his world title campaign, deteriorated badly after Marsh disclosed an epilepsy diagnosis that ended his fighting career. Marsh's position was that Warren had been told about the diagnosis before pressing him to continue fighting, specifically before getting him to sign a contract for his next mandatory defense. Warren denied knowing. The dispute went public, went to court as a libel action, and festered bitterly. Years later, Marsh talked about it with characteristic directness. On November 30th, 1989, Frank Warren was shot twice in the chest outside a theater in Barking, East London. He survived, but barely. He lost significant lung capacity. The masked gunman escaped. 2 months later, Terry Marsh was arrested at customs returning from Atlantic City. He spent 10 months on remand while prosecutors built a case around disputed motive, a prison witness whose testimony was heavily challenged, and some old ammunition found in his home that didn't match the murder weapon. He was acquitted at the Old Bailey in November 1990 after a jury deliberated for just 4 hours. No forensic link, no confession, no positive identification. He walked out, appeared on The Terry Wogan Show, and returned to his life. Decades later, when Frank Warren's autobiography revisited the episode, Marsh was publicly direct about the entire saga. That kind of bluntness had defined Marsh his whole career, and the jury that acquitted him had, in legal terms, settled the matter. No one was ever convicted for the shooting of Frank Warren. The case, technically, remains open. Edwin Valero. Some stories on this list involve men who squeezed through the gaps in a justice system that, through some combination of insufficient evidence and fortuitous timing, simply couldn't pin them down. Edwin Valero's story is categorically different from those. Valero's is the story of a man whose trajectory toward catastrophic violence was visible to almost everyone around him, and whose celebrity, political connections, and the institutional inertia of a sport unwilling to sacrifice a draw protected him from intervention, from consequences, from the help he arguably needed, until it was too late for anyone. Valero was a Venezuelan southpaw heavyweight of the lower divisions who compiled a perfect 27-0 professional record with 27 knockouts. Not 27 wins with some stoppages, 27 consecutive knockout victories, a distinction that made him the only WBC champion in the history of the organization to win every professional fight by knockout. He was an extraordinary and terrifying talent. He was also a man who had suffered a traumatic brain injury in a 2001 motorcycle accident, a skull fracture that required surgical intervention and left him with brain scan irregularities serious enough that New York State refused to license him throughout his career. The red flags outside the ring accumulated at roughly the same pace as the victories inside it. In September 2009, he was arrested after allegedly assaulting his mother and sister. His mother publicly minimized the incident. Meaningful consequences did not follow. In March 2010, his wife Jennifer Vieira Valero was hospitalized with a punctured lung and severe bruising. Valero said she had fallen downstairs. She reportedly did not contradict him publicly. He was ordered into psychiatric rehabilitation. He reportedly missed the flights required to attend it. Less than a month after that hospitalization, on April 18, 2010, Jennifer Vieira was found in a Valencia hotel room with multiple stab wounds. Valero left the room, found hotel security staff, and allegedly told them directly that he had killed his wife. He was arrested. He was taken to a jail in Carabobo. The following morning, he was found hanging in his cell, having used his own clothing as a ligature. He was 28 years old. Two young children lost both parents within 24 hours. He never faced trial. He never faced sentencing. His manager alleged that Valero had been killed by prison authorities, given his celebrity status, but official autopsy findings confirmed suicide. The story ended not in a courtroom, but in a cell without warning. Sugar Ray Robinson and the ring deaths. There is a version of boxing history in which deaths inside the ring are treated as tragic but legally uncomplicated. The understood and accepted cost of participating in a sport that has always, at its core, been about causing hurt. And for most of that history, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, the law has broadly agreed with that framing. In a sanctioned professional bout, both men consented to the risks, and if one of those risks was fatal, the law was generally inclined to call it an accident rather than a crime. Sugar Ray Robinson is the name that most people with any interest in boxing know in connection with this particular history, and for a reason that carries a strange, haunting specificity. Robinson is considered by many boxing historians to be the greatest fighter who ever lived. His record across 25 years of professional competition, welterweight champion, 5-time middleweight champion, over 200 professional bouts, placed him in a category by himself. But on the night of June 24, 1947, defending his welterweight title against a 22-year-old named Jimmy Doyle in Cleveland, Robinson fought through a premonition so powerful and so detailed that he tried to withdraw from the fight entirely. The night before, he had dreamed that he knocked Doyle down, and that Doyle lay dead in the ring with the crowd chanting around him. He told the promoters. They brought in a priest. The priest told him it was anxiety, that it was just a dream. He fought. He stopped Doyle in the 8th round with a left hook. Doyle was taken to the hospital unconscious and died approximately 17 hours later from a cerebral hemorrhage. Robinson reportedly donated the purses from several subsequent fights to Doyle's mother to help her purchase the house that Jimmy had been working toward giving her. Cleveland authorities threatened manslaughter charges. An inquest was opened, and then, as it almost always did in the history of the sport, the inquest concluded that the death was consistent with the accepted risks of professional boxing. No charges were brought. Robinson fought on for nearly 2 more decades. He was not alone in this history. Max Baer faced manslaughter charges in 1930 after Frankie Campbell died, following their fight, dismissed. Arthur Pelkey was prosecuted in 1913 in Canada after Luther McCarty collapsed and died in the ring from, as it turned out, a pre-existing spinal condition exacerbated by a prior horsefall. Exonerated. The legal principle that consenting adults who enter a ring together assume its risks has served as boxing's structural defense against criminal liability throughout the history of the sport, and with only the rarest of exceptions, it is held. For Robinson, for Baer, for Pelkey, and for dozens of others across a century and more of professional boxing, the ring's violence remained inside the ring. Iwao Hakamada. The last name on this list is different from every other name on it in one fundamental and devastating way, and that difference matters enough to say plainly before anything else. Iwao Hakamada did not get away with murder. He did not commit one. What he survived, across 6 decades and inside the most isolated and legally sanctioned form of slow destruction a state can apply to a human being, was the justice system's attempt to execute him for a crime that investigators appear to have fabricated evidence to pin on him. Hakamada was a Japanese professional boxer, a featherweight who fought 29 professional bouts between 1959 and 1961, winning 16. He was not a legend of the sport. He was a working professional athlete, the kind of fighter who makes the records of better-known men possible. He retired in 1961 and took a job as a live-in employee at a miso processing factory in Shizuoka Prefecture. On the night of June 30th, 1966, his employer's home caught fire. When the flames were brought under control, control, 4 bodies were found inside. The factory executive, his wife, and their 2 teenage children, all stabbed to death. A significant amount of cash was missing. Hakamada had helped fight the fire. He reported what he had seen. 2 months later, he was arrested. In the weeks that followed his arrest, Japanese police subjected him to interrogation sessions that he described as coercive beyond any reasonable standard, sessions that, by the eventual findings of a Japanese court 60 years later, were inhumane. He signed a confession. He immediately recanted it. In 1968, a 3-judge panel convicted him 2-1 of murder, robbery, and arson. The dissenting judge, whose vote of conscience was noted in the record, later became one of the most outspoken advocates for Hakamada's exoneration. He was sentenced to death and placed on death row, where he remained for 46 years. In Japan, death row inmates are not notified in advance of their execution date. He woke up every morning for 46 years, not knowing whether that was the day. His sister Hideko spent those same decades fighting for him from the outside. He was released pending retrial in 2014. On September 26, 2024, the Shizuoka District Court acquitted him, ruling that his confession had been extracted through inhumane methods and that key evidence, clothing allegedly found in the miso tank, had been fabricated by investigators. He was 88 years old at acquittal. In 2025, the Japanese government awarded him approximately $1.4 million in compensation, calculated at roughly $83 per day of detention. Hakamada is on this list because his story is the mirror image of every other story here, the one that shows you what getting away with it looks like from the other side of the law when it is the law itself doing the getting away. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.